I started something that was only meant to be a fleeting thrill, and now it's turned into one of my biggest regrets. Have you ever been in a situation like this? How did you handle the aftermath? I've made a huge mistake, and it's consuming me, but I don't know how to move forward. My husband, who is 45, and I, 40, have been married for 7 years and have a 5-year-old son together. We were introduced by a mutual friend who thought we'd hit it off. At first, we were just enjoying each other's company, not looking for anything serious. But as time went on, we realized we had a deep connection and decided to become exclusive. 2 years into our relationship, we got married. He's a software engineer at Google, and I work in sales at an insurance company. Everything in our family life was going well until I made a grave error about 5 months ago. My husband got a promotion at work, which meant he had to work longer hours. He came home tired every day, and our intimate moments became rare. Each time I tried to initiate something, he would dismiss me, saying he was too tired or giving some other reason. This started to really bother me, and to distract myself, I focused more on my job. One of my clients, Jay, a 48-year-old owner of a small fintech company, became a key part of my work. It was vital for my career to get his company's corporate health insurance contract with our firm, especially given the competitive insurance market. My boss told me to do whatever it took to win Jay's business and suggested I'd be more friendly than formal with him to build trust. So, I started to be more relaxed and informal around Jay. I tried not to let my husband's distant behavior get to me, but it wasn't easy. The same pattern continued, and eventually, I confronted him, asking if he was no longer attracted to me or if there was someone else. He assured me that wasn't the case and said his work stress was to blame. I believed him and stopped trying to initiate anything in the bedroom. With my son away at summer camp and my husband emotionally distant, I focused heavily on my job. The house felt lonely when I got back from work, a sharp contrast to earlier times of passion and closeness. Our communication had dwindled, and we rarely shared intimate moments. Meanwhile, my interactions with Jay were progressing well. He was engaging and good-looking. My job in corporate health insurance involved numerous discussions about procedures and formalities, often over meals with clients like Jay. I tried to strike the right balance between being professional and friendly, but it was challenging. Jay's comments during our meetings sometimes bordered on flirtatious, though he was subtle. I typically brushed these off, assuming he was just being friendly since he was single. During one lunch, I accidentally spilled water on myself and noticed Jay's gaze lingering where it shouldn't. I quickly redirected our talk back to work matters. I knew it wasn't appropriate, but a part of me relished the attention he paid me, a contrast to the neglect I felt at home. My husband's continuous disinterest had left me feeling unwanted and had eroded my self-confidence. Despite my awareness that it was wrong, I found myself appreciating the attention from another man, something I had been missing in my marriage. Through our work, Jay and I developed a friendly rapport. He started asking me out for meals that weren't related to work, and I enjoyed these breaks from the tension at home. I was drawn to Jay, but I hadn't intended for anything more to happen. At home, my husband was mostly secluded in his office, and by the time he got home, I would have finished dinner alone. Our home felt more like a temporary stay for him than a family space. Since I had stopped trying to initiate romance, he didn't either, and it was apparent he wasn't going to make the first move. Looking back, I recognized that I shouldn't have allowed things to escalate with Jay. During one of our lunches, I found myself flirting with him, craving the attention and affection I wasn't getting from my husband. That evening, I did something completely out of character. I went home with Jay. My frustration and feelings of neglect led me to cross a line I had never imagined crossing. I left his place in the middle of the night, feeling confused and unsure. As I got into my car, I noticed I had missed calls from my husband. I hoped he'd be asleep by the time I got back so that I wouldn't have to explain where I had been. Luckily, he was asleep when I got home, so I silently went to shower. The next morning, he asked about my whereabouts the night before, and I lied, claiming I had a late work meeting. My husband hardly responded to my explanation and simply continued eating his breakfast. I felt guilty about lying, but his lack of interest in me was still painful. It was then that I resolved not to see Jay anymore, as the contract with his company was almost over. I wouldn't need to meet with him much longer. I convinced myself that my indiscretion was a one-time mistake, reminding myself of my responsibilities to my husband and son. Determined to move past this, I threw myself into work, trying to ignore the emotional impact of my husband's aloofness. I ended up spending most evenings at the office, knowing that the warmth and anticipation that used to greet me at home were no longer there. My son was away at camp for another month, and attempts to connect with my husband during the week were met with his preoccupation and lack of engagement. He seemed content with his own activities. At least Jay didn't reach out to me after our night together, which I had somewhat anticipated. Despite telling myself it was just a one-off incident, I was surprised by his complete lack of communication. Then, unexpectedly, on a Friday as I was leaving the office, I found Jay waiting for me. He approached and hugged me, saying he had missed me. I was taken aback by his sudden appearance and affection, unsure of how to respond. I told Jay that what happened between us was a mistake and couldn't happen again. He looked hurt by my words and clung to me, arguing that it wasn't a mistake and insisting on the undeniable attraction between us. His words made me falter in my resolve that it was just a one-time thing. Overcome by the moment, I kissed him again. We found ourselves getting intimate in his car in the parking lot, an entirely new and exhilarating experience for me. I promised to call him later before driving home. Once home, I went straight to the shower. When my husband returned and went to sleep without even a kiss, I made up my mind to see Jay again. I knew my actions were selfish and wrong, but with Jay, I didn't feel neglected. Even though I was aware of the potential consequences, a part of me wanted to ignore them. That's how my affair with Jay started. Jay knew about my husband and son and was surprisingly fine with our situation. I emphasized the need for discretion and to avoid being seen together. He suggested we could meet up as colleagues or friends like we had before, and I agreed. Things seemed to go smoothly. My husband barely asked questions, so I didn't have to lie much. He noticed my late returns and occasional unreachability, but my vague replies were enough for him. He never probed further. The fact that my husband wasn't suspicious brought mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a relief, but on the other, it was disheartening because his lack of suspicion seemed to come from indifference rather than trust. Jay and I would meet at his place, or he'd pick me up after work when he could. We shared lunches and dinners, and sometimes we were intimate in his car or in elevators without cameras. The thrill of being with someone in such secretive public spaces was exhilarating, a kind of excitement I hadn't found in my marriage. This affair with a client was more thrilling than I ever imagined. The adrenaline rush from our clandestine meetings added a new dimension to my life. With Jay, I was rediscovering a sense of adventure and excitement that was missing from my relationship with my husband. Despite the excitement, I recognized that I was settling for something that wasn't ideal, but I found enjoyment in it nonetheless. After 2 months, my son returned from summer camp, and I had to readjust my schedule to accommodate his routine. This meant initially spending less time with Jay, but I managed to rearrange things so we could continue seeing each other. My affair with Jay didn't have a clear direction. I was navigating it without a specific plan. When I expressed my uncertainty to Jay, he comforted me by suggesting we just take things one day at a time without thinking too far ahead. His reassurance was a comfort I hadn't received from my husband, who was often preoccupied with work. However, it wasn't just his recent promotion that led to this situation. Even before that, he had always been focused on his job, leaving me to handle most of our home and parenting responsibilities alone. His promotion only intensified these dynamics. He used to carve out time for me on weekends or after dinner, but that had stopped once I began my affair with Jay. My husband's lack of attention became less bothersome. With Jay, I found the attention and affection I craved, both emotionally and physically. As time passed, I became increasingly indifferent to my husband's behavior, recognizing that he wasn't truly invested in me. I had been in denial earlier, but now it was glaringly obvious. He never tried to be intimate with me, which, although I no longer wanted it from him, highlighted his lack of interest. The thought of ending our marriage crossed my mind, but I pushed it aside for our son's sake. Despite his failings as a partner, my husband was an attentive father. He made sure our son had everything, including quality time with him. His rare breaks from work were always dedicated to our son, complicating the idea of separating our child from his dad. I couldn't imagine being apart from my son either, so the idea of joint custody was unbearable. With the thought of him shuttling between two homes, I decided to stay in the marriage primarily for our son. My feelings for my husband were fading fast, but my love for my child was what kept me there. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. My career was on the rise, my affair with Jay was fulfilling, and home life was stable considering the situation. My husband remained deeply engrossed in his work, seemingly oblivious to my presence. I doubt he would have noticed if I had disappeared from his life altogether. To balance my time, I started having lunch with Jay, allowing me to go straight home after work to be with my son. Jay was very understanding of my circumstances, accommodating our meetings to suit my schedule. His empathy and flexibility were remarkable. I thought everything was under control and going as planned, but I couldn't have been more mistaken. Soon, things took a sudden and dramatic turn, changing everything. Unexpectedly, on the day everything changed, I was on my way to meet Jay for lunch when my phone fell down the stairs. I decided to get it fixed later, as I didn't want to delay seeing Jay. He suggested we go to his place, and since it was Friday, I thought it would be fine to leave work early, so I went with him. I got home around my usual time, 6 o'clock in the evening, but to my shock, my son wasn't there. Instead, I found Beth, our nanny, who we hired to look after him after school until my husband or I got home. Beth told me that my son had a high fever at school and had been taken to the hospital. His teacher had tried to call me several times but couldn't get through. Eventually, my husband got the call and went to the hospital. I was in a panic and immediately headed there. My broken phone was the reason I missed the calls. When I got to the hospital, I saw my husband comforting our son, who was now feeling better and telling stories about school. I joined them, but my husband didn't ask any questions about where I had been. The doctor came to see us and let us know that our son had caught the flu but was now well enough to be discharged. I drove our son home while my husband said he had to return to his office, having left abruptly to be with our son at the hospital. Once home, I fed our son and tucked him into bed, making a mental note to get my phone fixed the next day. That night, I decided to sleep in my son's room. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to find my husband standing at the doorway, looking at me. I was startled at first, but then I recognized him and felt relieved. I noticed he was still in his work clothes and asked him when he had gotten back. He said he had just arrived and wanted to check on our son before heading to bed. I simply nodded in response. When my husband asked about where I was during the teacher's call, I told him about my broken phone and how that prevented them from reaching me. He seemed doubtful and pointed to my damaged phone on the shelf, indicating he knew I hadn't been at work. He said he had called my office, where they informed him I had left for lunch and never came back. His call to my office wasn't unexpected, but with my focus on my son, I hadn't thought about how to explain my absence. I quickly said I had been in a late meeting, but his face didn't give away whether he believed me or not. I just hoped he did and continued caring for our son. The next day, I decided to stay home with my son and also needed to address my phone issue. While Beth cared for my son, I went out to buy a new phone, as fixing the old one would take too long. My first call on the new phone was to Jay, where I explained everything. He was as supportive and understanding as always. After his initial questioning, my husband didn't bring up the topic of my whereabouts again. The following days passed without major incidents. My son got better and returned to school, and our home life seemed to resume its usual routine. Returning to my regular office routine, I continued to meet Jay during lunch breaks. But one Friday, to my surprise, I found my husband at home before me, something that hadn't happened in a long time. I greeted him cheerfully and was about to take a shower when he stopped me to ask about my lunch break activities. I was puzzled about how he knew I had been out. He told me he had been to my office to get my signature for some bank documents. I repeated the same excuse I had given him previously, and he seemed to accept it. However, before letting me go, he softly mentioned that he trusted me. Those words hit me hard. I was having an affair, yet he trusted me. The guilt was overwhelming, and I couldn't help crying in the shower. Reflecting on it, I realized that while he may not have been the perfect husband, I hadn't been a faithful wife either. His trust in me felt so wrong, knowing that I was betraying him. I knew I couldn't continue living a lie. I had two choices: confess everything to my husband and end things with Jay, or break off my affair with Jay without telling my husband. The decision was incredibly hard, and just thinking about losing either of them brought me to tears. Jay was a genuinely kind person who had been good to me, but I knew we had no future together. Leaving my husband and son wasn't an option I was willing to consider. I decided that the right thing to do was to end my relationship with Jay. I planned to see him one more time after the weekend to break it off, unaware that time was not on my side. On Saturday, I planned to spend the day at home with my son. My husband's plans were unclear, as he rarely shared much with me since his promotion, often absorbed in work even on weekends. To my surprise, he stayed home that day instead of going to the office. His presence was unexpected, especially since he had come home early the day before. This change in his routine raised suspicion in me, but I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my guilt and fear of being caught. When our son left for the park with Beth, our nanny, my husband and I were left alone in the living room. In a calm manner, he told me we needed to have a conversation. His calm and neutral demeanor led me to think he was unaware of my affair with Jay, but I was completely wrong. My husband had known about us. He described his growing suspicions as I began coming home late and how they were confirmed after our son's hospitalization. He recounted how he had seen me with Jay during his visits to my office at lunchtime, even showing me pictures he had taken of Jay and me together, including ones of us kissing passionately. With such undeniable evidence in front of me, I had no choice but to confess. He listened as I explained everything from the start, how the affair began after he got his promotion and started neglecting our relationship. I shared my feelings and how Jay had filled the void of being desired and cherished. Throughout my confession, he kept his expression neutral. When I told him about my plan to end the affair on Monday, he didn't seem to believe me. He chuckled, pointing out that there was no need for lies now, as he already knew everything. I was relieved by his direct approach, yet he made it clear that he couldn't trust anything I said anymore. He explained that he had been working hard at his job to provide for us, including making plans for an upcoming international trip. He reminded me that he might not have been the perfect husband, but he had always been faithful. His words struck a chord, and I felt tears well up. He mentioned that he had planned to confront me the previous day but had given me a chance to come clean. When he expressed his trust in me, he had hoped for a different reaction, and I realized just how much I had let him down. After leaving me alone in the living room to process everything, he returned with a glass of water and an envelope. I immediately knew what was inside: divorce papers. He had prepared them after seeing me with Jay in the parking lot. I was taken aback and hesitantly took the envelope from him. As I feared, the papers were for divorce, and he was seeking full custody of our son. I protested, but he argued it was for the best interest of our child. I couldn't agree to sign them under those terms. However, he warned that if I didn't, he would tell our son about my affair, leading him to possibly resent me. I was shocked that my husband would use such a tactic, threatening to tell our young son about the affair at only 5 years old. Such information would be devastating for him. I realized my husband was determined to get what he wanted, even if it meant leveraging our son in the process. My affair had already caused harm, and the thought of our son resenting me was unbearable. So, I begged my husband not to follow through with his threat. However, my tearful pleas didn't sway him. He was adamant about his decision and gave me just 2 days to sign the divorce papers. He also insisted that I end things with Jay immediately, threatening to show our son the pictures of Jay and me together if I didn't comply. Unsure if he would really do it, I couldn't take the risk of exposing our son to such distressing images. My priority was to ensure a stable and healthy future for him. Left alone in the living room, I called Jay and ended our relationship. Jay understood that my son had to come first, and he didn't argue. He wished me well and even offered help if I ever needed it. Despite everything, I felt grateful to him for his understanding and kindness in this difficult moment. I reached out to my lawyer to discuss the custody terms in the divorce papers. He advised me that I could refuse those terms and fight for full custody of my son. However, I couldn't tell him about the blackmail from my husband involving my affair. Our call ended soon after. I felt cornered, facing no favorable choices. Whichever path I chose, it seemed I would lose my son if I didn't sign the papers. My affair would be exposed, potentially causing my son to resent me forever, or I could sign them and let him stay with his father, sparing him from the harsh truth. I opted for the latter, signing the papers. I could handle being apart from my son, but the idea of him hating me was unbearable. I hoped he would keep some good memories of me. My husband seemed content once I signed the divorce papers. He gave me a week to explain to our son why I would be leaving. It felt like he was using this situation to punish me. Although I knew I had to face the repercussions of my actions, I never imagined it would result in losing my son. I had always hesitated to consider divorce because of my son, but now I was left with no other choice than to say goodbye to him. Telling my son that I was leaving was the most agonizing experience I've ever had. His tears during our conversation brought me to tears too, and even now, just thinking about it is painful. I did my best to explain to him that his dad would take care of him and that we would be together again soon. Seeing the hurt in his eyes was nearly unbearable, but I tried to stay strong for him. I treasured every moment I had with him that week. On Friday, when I dropped him off at school, I told him I wouldn't be home when he got back. He cried again, and I hugged him, promising we'd see each other soon. My husband watched us throughout the week. I secretly hoped that seeing my distress might change his decision, but he remained unmoved. I arranged for movers to take my things to a company apartment, the only quick option I had. When I left our house, my husband was there, showing no emotion. His indifference was clear. He told me he had started the divorce process and that his lawyers would handle everything. I just nodded. I asked him to take care of our son and apologized for my actions. He assured me he would care for our son and told me I didn't need to worry. With that, I left the house, not saying anything more. It's been over a month since these events unfolded, and the divorce is still in progress. The attorneys have assured us that it should be resolved quickly since it's uncontested. I've moved into an apartment provided by my company, not having the energy to look for another place. My ex-husband has allowed me to talk to our son 3 times. I miss him so much, and it hurts deeply, but I take comfort in knowing he is being well taken care of. My ex was always a great father, and I had no doubt he would continue to be so for our son. My son mentioned that his dad now comes home early and spends a lot of time with him. This is bittersweet for me. I can't help but think that if these changes had happened while I was still there, maybe things would have turned out differently. While I know my affair was my own doing, it still hurts to realize that he couldn't make such efforts when I was a part of their lives. Focusing on my work has become my primary goal as it's the only significant activity filling my days now. Since our final conversation at my home, I haven't reached out to Jay, and he hasn't tried to contact me either, which I'm thankful for. In light of being separated from my son, I doubt I could have continued anything with Jay anyway. The regret of having had an affair is a constant weight on my heart. I often wish I hadn't acted on impulse and started a relationship with him. If I had shown more patience and not betrayed my husband, I might still be living with my son. Perhaps over time, my husband might have given more attention to our relationship. 2 months have passed since I left our family home, and our divorce is now officially finalized. When my attorney asked if I wanted anything from my husband, I declined any claim to his assets. My only true desire was for my son, and since that wasn't possible, nothing else mattered to me. I've learned that my husband has moved on. My son mentioned seeing Beth, our nanny, coming out of my ex-husband's room one morning, which was a shock to me. Beth is in her early 30s. The ease with which my husband seemed to have moved on made me wonder, but then I realized I had no right to judge, considering my own actions contributed to the end of our marriage. Still, it hurt. I reassured my son, suggesting maybe Beth had just gone there to fetch something. Despite my ex-husband using our son against me during our separation, I refused to stoop to such tactics. I wouldn't manipulate my son to get back at his father. I was just grateful to talk to my son whenever I could. Beth would call me at my son's request, which I appreciated. Maybe she felt guilty about her relationship with my ex-husband, but I still thanked her for letting me talk to my son. I also got to spend weekends with him, which became the best part of my life. He would fill me in on everything, making sure I didn't miss out on any part of his life. The regret over starting the affair remained, especially poignant when I had to return my son to his father's house, the house that used to be mine too. It's been a year since my last update, and my son recently celebrated his 6th birthday. he's adjusted remarkably to the changes in our lives. About 6 months after I left the house, he stopped crying when I would leave him. Now, he just smiles when I drop him off, a bittersweet reminder of our changed relationship. It's somewhat comforting to know I no longer make him cry, but it also leaves me wondering if he misses me. In other news, my ex-husband is now engaged to Beth, our former nanny. They plan to get married in 6 months. Even though I was the one who strayed, it's still hard to see him moving on with someone else, especially in the home we once shared. I found out about their engagement during one of my visits to drop off my son. I saw them sharing an intimate kiss, something I hadn't experienced with him in a long time. My arrival interrupted them. Beth seemed embarrassed, but my ex appeared almost pleased that I had seen their display of affection. The engagement ring on Beth's finger was unmistakable. My ex-husband took that opportunity to inform me about their engagement and upcoming wedding. I managed to smile, but his expression seemed to relish the discomfort he thought I felt. They resumed their embrace, and I couldn't help but feel that he was using this moment to get back at me for my infidelity. After kissing my son goodbye, I left. I want to thank everyone who offered support and empathy without judgment. While I may not know you personally, your kindness has been a significant source of comfort during this challenging time.